They called her the quiet one. Just a nurse. Nobody special. Dr. Mercer didn't know that Megan O'Brien had carried a wounded Marine general 3 miles through Bagram under sniper fire. He didn't know her hands had performed battlefield decompression in sandstorms where the air was so thick with dust you breathed blood. He didn't know the 3-inch scar behind her left ear where shrapnel had carved bone, or the faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket like a whispered confession she was never allowed to speak aloud. What he saw was a nurse who ate lunch alone. The fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek Medical's trauma unit buzz overhead like insects trapped in plastic, casting everything in that particular shade of white that makes you forget what natural light looks like. Megan adjusts the 4 on her post-op patient in bed for her movements economical, practiced, muscle memory from 8 months of 12-hour shifts and 2 decades of something else she doesn't talk about. The antiseptic smell clings to her scrubs, that sharp chemical bite that never quite washes out, mixing with the metallic scent of fear that bleeds from every patient who passes through these hallways. It's a Tuesday in October when Dr. Mercer first really notices her. The code blue comes without warning at 2:17 p.m. A 54-year-old male, post-op from a routine appendectomy, suddenly desaturating on the med-surg floor. His oxygen drops like a stone, from 98 down to 87, then 78, and the alarm screams across the monitors with that specific pitch that makes everyone's movements quicken. The crash cart arrives in 30 seconds. The team assembles, 2 residents, a nurse from pediatrics who happen to be nearby, and Mercer, who strides in with the authority of a man who has memorized every relevant textbook and forgotten none of them. The patient is in arrest. Sinus rhythm gone. Just a flat line and the sound of rubber gloves snapping like gunshots in the silence. Mercer takes position at the head of the bed, already calling orders. Push 1 milligram epi. Let's get a 12 lead. Someone get me a setup for pericardiocentesis, I think we're looking at tamponade. His voice carries the weight of Johns Hopkins, Yale, and 15 years of being right about difficult cases. Megan is already moving before he finishes speaking. She doesn't ask permission. She doesn't wait for protocol. Her hands reach past the resident who is fumbling with the defibrillator pads and she's already assessing, already knowing, already seeing what Mercer hasn't considered yet. The chest wall. The pressure. The way the patient's abdomen is distending slightly, the belly tight like a drum about to split. Tension pneumothorax, she says. Not a question. A diagnosis. Mercer's eyes snap to her. His expression is the look of a man being contradicted by someone 3 pay grades below him. We're treating for cardiac tamponade. The EKG? Check the breath sounds. Her voice doesn't rise. It doesn't plead. It simply states fact like someone reading a weather report. Left side is absent. Pressure's collapsed the lung. For exactly 2 seconds, nobody moves. The monitor screams. The patient's oxygen is at 71 now. The heart rate on the screen has become a series of random electrical impulses that bear no relationship to life. Mercer hesitates. It's barely perceptible, a single moment where his surgical pride wars with the logic in front of him, and then he nods to the resident. Get me a 14-gauge needle. Midclavicular line, second intercostal space. But Megan's hand is already out. She's already got the needle. She's already prepped the site with one fluid motion, the kind of motion that belongs to someone who has done this not in a controlled operating room but in the dark, in the dust, with the taste of copper in her mouth and the sound of gunfire framing the work. The needle goes in. Just 1 second. One perfect moment of precision. The hiss of air escaping is the sound of a life coming back. The patient's oxygen immediately starts climbing. 75, 78. 82, 85. His heart rate stabilizes. The flat line becomes rhythm. Sinus. Perfect. Clean. The room goes so quiet you can hear the ventilator settling into its mechanical breath. Mercer stares at her for exactly 3 seconds. He doesn't say thank you. He doesn't acknowledge that she just saved someone's life using a technique that belongs to people in helicopters and forward operating bases, not people in green scrubs in a Denver hospital. What he does instead is turn away, and as he walks out, his jaw tightens just slightly. It's a look Megan has learned to recognize. It's the look of a man who has just realized that someone he thought was beneath him might actually be something else entirely. That same afternoon, Megan is checking on the patients in the recovery bay when she notices bed 7. The Marine General is awake now, more awake than he's been since he was admitted 5 days ago. His brain injury, a traumatic blast concussion from a roadside IED outside Bagram last month, has stolen most of his recent memories, but his eyes are tracking her as she moves through the room with that peculiar intensity that some people carry even when everything else is broken. His forearm is bandaged, but beneath the gore she knows what's there. She's seen it before. Her name. Tattooed in the muscular space above his wrist, letters that look almost like a prayer or a command or both. She doesn't know how he got it. Doesn't know when. The classified operation, the one that cost her everything and gave her a new name and a new life in a city 4 states away, lives in a folder that doesn't exist, in files that were shredded, in reports that were never filed. He watches her adjust his 4. His eyes follow her face with the intensity of someone trying to remember something that matters. She can see him searching. Can see the moment he realizes he can't find what he's looking for. The frustration crosses his face like a shadow, and then it fades into confusion, and then something almost like resignation. She says nothing. Just checks the medication drip, documents the vitals in his chart, blood pressure 127/82, heart rate steady at 68, oxygen saturation excellent, and moves to the next patient. It's the only mercy she can offer him, to not make him work for something his damaged brain can't quite reach. The MacGuffin sits in the employee locker room later that day, tucked inside Megan's jacket where it always stays. The patch is maybe 4 inches by 3 inches, faded to a color that might be forest green or might be brown depending on the light. The words are barely visible anymore, 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. The edges are frayed. One corner is singed from heat that no one should ever have survived. She touches it only when no one is watching. By the time Mercer makes his move, it's subtle enough that no one else notices. He's in the medication dispensary around 3:45 p.m., standing near the controlled substance cabinet where the opioids are logged and locked and tracked like radioactive material. 2 senior nurses, Patricia from the day shift and someone newer, fresh out of orientation, are checking inventory when he leans against the counter with the casual body language of a man who is simply making conversation. You ever check the nursing credentials on our trauma staff? His voice is the kind of casual that takes practice. The kind of casual that feels like a question but is actually a suggestion. I'm just wondering. That new nurse, O'Brien? I noticed something today during a code. Some technique I didn't recognize. Wondered where she trained. Patricia, who is 52 and has worked medical for 28 years and knows the sound of a setup when she hears one, doesn't look up from her clipboard. Her credentials are on file. Dr. Mercer. Of course they are. He smiles. It's the kind of smile that doesn't reach his eyes. Just seems unusual. That level of battlefield. I mean, emergency medicine skill. For someone working the trauma unit here in Denver, you know? Makes you wonder where she came from. The words are just vague enough. Just suggestive enough. Enough doubt to plant a seed in the kind of soil where doubt grows into questions and questions grow into gossip. He leaves before anyone can respond. By the time Megan takes her lunch break at noon the next day, the isolation has already started. She sits in the staff room on a gray chair that never should have been purchased, holding a container of chicken and rice from a place 3 blocks away. The room smells like stale coffee and the particular sadness of fluorescent lighting at midday. There are 7 other people in the room when she sits down. Within 90 seconds, there are 3. It happens without drama. Patricia excuses herself to take a phone call. One of the residents picks up his food and says something about needing to review a chart. By the time Megan has opened her container, the room has transformed into a place where she is present but separate, like a word that has been deleted from a sentence but the space is still there. She eats in silence. Her hands are steady. Her breathing is even. Her jaw doesn't clench. This is not new. This is not shocking. This is just the texture of being something that people aren't supposed to notice, living among people who have just been told to notice. The salt on the chicken tastes like every deployment. The rice tastes like every base where she was never officially there. What happened next wasn't visible to anyone watching. There were no monitors to track it. No vital signs to climb or fall. Just a single shift in the hospital's invisible architecture, the kind of shift that happens when one man with credentials and institutional authority decides that another person doesn't deserve any. The rumor started small. It always does. Dr. Mercer cornered two senior nurses by the medication dispensary on Thursday morning, his voice pitched low enough that only they could hear. "I'm not saying she bought her credentials online," he said, his tone suggesting he was saying exactly that, "but has anyone actually verified Cedar Creek's background check? That code blue procedure yesterday, where does a community college nurse learn force recon-level emergency response?" He let the question hang there like bait. Just wondering if we're being thorough enough with our hiring standards these days. The two nurses exchanged glances. One of them, Patricia, a 20-year veteran, opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. Neither wanted to be the person defending someone they barely knew. By noon, the story had mutated. By evening, it had teeth. By Friday morning, the break room conversation died the moment Megan walked through the door. She was holding her lunch container, a faded plastic Tupperware with a cracked lid, nothing that warranted the sudden silence. Three nurses stood simultaneously, their chairs scraping against linoleum in a sound like a threat. They left without speaking. Megan set her lunch on the table and stared at it for a moment, then picked it back up and walked out. She ate in her car after that. Sitting in the parking lot of Cedar Creek Medical, watching rain bead on the windshield like tiny judgments, eating a sandwich that had gone soggy because she no longer had anywhere safe to store it. The antiseptic smell of the hospital clung to her scrubs even here, even with the windows down. Dr. Mercer was building something. Not with his hands, with words. With implications. With the kind of authority that didn't require proof, only a reputation and a willingness to deploy it like a weapon. On Saturday morning, he escalated. He printed the fabricated write-up himself. She found out later he'd doctored the timestamps, shifted her initials to align with medication errors that had never happened. Megan hadn't given the patient's pain medication 15 minutes late. She hadn't given it 17 minutes early. She hadn't given it at all, that had been Derek from the night shift. But the paperwork said otherwise. Mercer had circled her name in red marker, deep angry circles that bled through to the back of the page. He posted it on the unit board where every staff member would see it. That afternoon, during her shift, Megan passed the break room and saw it. 3 copies. He'd made copies. Her name in red marker, her initials on false documentation, her competence under question in the language of bureaucracy, the only language that mattered in a hospital. She didn't look away. She read every word, noting the dates, the times, the carefully constructed cascade of errors that painted her as careless. As incompetent. As someone who shouldn't be trusted with medication distribution. When she finished reading, she walked back to bed 7. The general was there, a massive man diminished by hospital corners and fall lines. His name was Whitmore. She'd seen it in the admission paperwork. She'd also seen the tattoo on his forearm, her own call sign, rendered in dark blue ink faded by time. Valkyrie. She had no idea how he'd gotten it. His chart said traumatic brain injury from an IED exposure 16 months ago in Afghanistan. His memory was fractured. He recognized people and then forgot them. He had good days and bad days. Today was a bad day. "Help you?" he asked when she checked his his voice rough from the breathing tube he'd needed last week. "Just routine," she said. Her voice was steady. That was the training kicking in, the part of her that had learned to compartmentalize, to move forward even when the ground was burning beneath her feet. Even when she was standing in a hospital in Denver and a man who knew her name wore her call sign on his arm and had no idea who she was. Around 3 p.m. on Saturday, Dr. Mercer made his move. He stormed into the general's room without knocking, his white coat billowing like a cape. The patient's adult children were there, a daughter and her husband, visiting from out of state. They looked up in surprise at the interruption. Mercer didn't acknowledge them. He went directly to Megan, who was changing the patient's dressing with the kind of focused attention that came from compartmentalizing personal disasters. "Nurse O'Brien," he said, his voice pitched to carry weight and authority in equal measure. "Explain to this family why you administered their father's pain medication 15 minutes off schedule." Again. He pulled a paper from his clipboard. The fabricated write-up. He held it up like evidence in a courtroom, the red circles visible even from across the room. Megan's hands didn't pause. She kept working. "Dr. Mercer, I need to finish this dressing." "No," he said. "I think the family should know what kind of care their father is receiving. I think they should understand the pattern of negligence they're looking at." His voice was rising now, his face flushing with the righteousness of a man who believed he was defending standards. "This is the third documentation error this week, the third from this particular nurse. Do they teach basic charting at whatever diploma mill you attended, or were you too busy fantasizing about being important?" The family exchanged uncomfortable glances. The son-in-law shifted his weight. The daughter's eyes went down to the bedsheet. Megan finished the dressing. She taped the final corner of gauze with precision, her movements careful and deliberate. Then she stood. And she turned to face him. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet where you could hear the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, the steady beep of the cardiac monitor, the fluorescent lights humming their electric song overhead. When Megan spoke, her voice was steady and cold, like a scalpel drawn across ice. "I've seen better men than you die begging for morphine they'd never get. You just beg for attention." She turned on her heel and walked out of the room. Her spine was straight. Her stride was measured. Her face was carved from something harder than stone. Behind her, the general stirred in his bed, something flickering across his face, recognition, maybe, or the ghost of it. His hand moved to his forearm where her call sign was tattooed in fading blue. His fractured brain trying to connect two things that didn't fit together anymore, the name he'd known and the face he couldn't remember. By Monday morning, the whispers had solidified into something else entirely. Megan entered the nurse's station, and the room responded like a living thing drawing back from something dangerous. One nurse stood. Then another. Then a third. They didn't leave together, that would have been too obvious, but they left. One by one. Their absence was heavier than any words could have been. She was standing in a space the hospital had carved out around her, a zone of isolation that had been constructed brick by brick, rumor by rumor, with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly how to dismantle a person's credibility. That was when the general's monitors began to alarm. His oxygen saturation was dropping. Fast. 94, then 91, then 87. Megan was already moving, her hand reaching for the call button because protocol required it, because procedure demanded it, because she was a nurse and nurses followed the rules even when the rules were designed to slow them down. Dr. Mercer was there within minutes, looking at the monitor with an expression of clinical detachment. The general's breathing had become labored, each inhalation a visible struggle. His chest was rising unevenly, the left side lagging, the right side compensating. "His O2 is at 89%, Mercer said, as if the number itself was evidence of nothing being wrong. "We'll increase his supplemental oxygen and monitor." "Stop being dramatic." Megan's jaw tightened. The sound of her teeth coming together was almost audible in the sudden tension of the room. "His trachea is deviating," she said, keeping her voice level. "His chest is asymmetric. He needs immediate decompression." Mercer stepped between her and the patient in a movement that was deliberately, pointedly physical. A barrier. A boundary. A man asserting his authority over her assessment, her expertise, her right to save this man's life. What he needs, Mercer said, is for you to follow orders instead of playing doctor. Step back. The general's oxygen dropped to 84. Then 80. His lips were starting to turn blue, the color of hypoxia, the color of a body running out of air. Mercer was on the phone with radiology now, calling for a portable X-ray, requesting confirmation of what the clinical presentation screamed. 20 minutes. That was how long confirmation would take. The general had maybe 5. Megan looked at this man. At his massive frame diminished by hospital corners. At his forearm with her call sign tattooed in blue. At the monitors displaying a body in distress. At Dr. Mercer, who was now distracted by the radiology technician, explaining where they should position the equipment. She made her choice the way she'd made 1,000 choices before, instantly, completely, with no hesitation and no doubt. She moved to the bedside. Her hands found the second intercostal space, the anatomical landmark she'd learned in a briefing room in Kandahar, the same space she'd accessed in field hospitals and in the back of helicopters and in the dust of compounds where the rules of civilian medicine didn't apply. She located the midclavicular line. She took the 14-gauge needle from the crash cart. And she drove it between his ribs with the precision of someone who'd performed this procedure while rounds of fire were coming through walls. The hiss of air was immediate. Audible. The sound of pressure equalizing, of a lung re-expanding, of a body getting another chance. The general's oxygen saturation began climbing. 82, 85. 89, 93. His color returned like a sunset in reverse, the blue fading from his lips, the gray retreating from his face. Through the glass wall of the ICU room, the entire night shift had gathered. 30 people. 40. Watching in stunned silence as a nurse they'd been trained to avoid, a nurse they'd been taught to doubt, performed a procedure that was supposed to require a physician's hands. Dr. Mercer spun around. His face went pale first, a full second of shock where his skin lost all color. Then it went red. A deep, violent red that started at his neck and climbed toward his hairline like a flood. "You just assaulted a patient," he said. His voice was shaking. "You just ended your career." He pulled out his phone with movements that were jerky, furious, deliberate. "I want security, HR, and the night administrator here now," he said into the phone, never breaking eye contact with Megan. "We have a code of conduct violation. A serious one." The room remained silent except for the steady beeping of the monitors and the mechanical wheeze of the ventilator and the sound of Mercer's voice delivering the sentence he believed he was pronouncing on her career. What he didn't know was that sentence had already been written. It had been written in Kandahar. It had been written in a compound that no longer existed. It had been written in the muscles of her hands and the architecture of her mind and the weight of memories that no rumor, no fabrication, no red-circled write-up could ever touch. The general's breathing changed at 11:08 p.m. Shallow. Rapid. The kind of pattern Megan recognized from a compound in Helmand Province where a Marine took shrapnel and his left lung collapsed while they waited for dust-off. She was running labs when the monitor caught her attention, oxygen saturation dropping in increments. 94. 91. 88. Not the steady decline of sepsis or pneumonia. This was acute. This was now. She moved to bed 7 without running it through the trauma team first. That decision would matter later when lawyers reviewed it. When a man in a suit asked her why she didn't wait for protocol. But protocol wasn't written for what she saw, the general's chest barely moving, his color shifting from healthy pink to something closer to gray ash, his neck veins beginning to distend like they were being inflated from inside. Tension pneumothorax. Collapsed lung. Positive pressure building in the thoracic cavity, pushing against his heart with every breath he couldn't take. Another 3 minutes and the general would code. Another 5 and he'd be dead on the table with nothing to save him. Megan didn't call the crash cart. She called for a 14-gauge needle and didactic calm settled over her like muscle memory pulling on combat boots. "I need a decompression kit. Now." Her voice had changed. It wasn't a request. It was a command the same way an officer's voice is a command, stripped of politeness, pure authority, the kind of tone that made people move without asking why. A respiratory therapist went pale and thrust the needle into her hand. A young nurse, one of the three who still made eye contact with her, cleared the general's right chest wall with antiseptic that smelled like copper pennies and alcohol fires. Megan's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this before in conditions far worse. In a Humvee rolling through Sanjin Valley with mortar fire walking across the compound. In a reinforced outpost with nothing but field equipment and the knowledge that the nearest surgical team was 40 kilometers away. She palpated the second intercostal space, found the midclavicular line like reading an old map. The needle went in. The hiss came immediately, air escaping from a lung that had been crushed under pressure. Not a whisper. Not a gentle release. A sound like a tire deflating, like pressure equalizing, like physics correcting itself. The entire trauma unit heard it. Through the glass walls of the bay, through the open doors, down the corridor where Mercer had been standing with the night supervisor. The general's oxygen monitor climbed. 89. 92. 96. 100%. His color returned in seconds, blood perfusing back through skin that had gone the shade of old denim. His breathing deepened. His shoulders relaxed. The mechanical struggle was gone. The body had been saved because someone had recognized the pattern and moved faster than protocol allowed. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Ashford, the cardiothoracic surgeon on call, arrived 10 minutes later. He walked into the bay with the casual authority of a man who had spent 30 years being right, and he read the chart, looked at the needle, looked at the patient whose saturation was now stable at 98%, and his expression changed like someone had pulled a mask away. He turned to Megan with the kind of stare that surgeons reserve for moments when they understand they arrived to find the work already done. "You performed the decompression." His voice was quiet. Dangerous. The kind of quiet that fills a room like pressure. "Yes, sir." Single needle, second intercostal. Midclavicular line. 14-gauge angiocath with the catheter advanced. Air released immediately. Ashford nodded slowly. He looked at the general, whose eyes were opening now, whose breathing was the normal rhythm of a man whose lungs were working. He turned back to Megan and said the words that would become evidence, that would be written in the chart, that Dr. Mercer would try to delete and fail. 3 more minutes. That's all it would have taken. 3 minutes and this man is dead. You just saved his life. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum, a sound like insects caught in plastic, like electricity trying to escape. Mercer was standing at the glass. His face had the color of someone watching a fortress crumble. Because he understood, in that moment, what had just happened. Megan O'Brien, the nurse with the questionable credentials, the nurse with the gaps in her employment history, the nurse he had spent 8 weeks systematically destroying, had just performed an emergency surgical intervention with the kind of precision that could only come from one source. And he couldn't unsee it. He couldn't unhear the testimonial from a cardiothoracic surgeon. He couldn't delete the fact that the entire night shift had witnessed it. He reached for his phone. The first call went to a board member who owed him a favor from a hospital expansion vote 3 years prior. The second went to another board member, this one with a political career that Mercer had helped build. The third call was placed while standing in the stairwell, his voice low and measured like a man moving pieces on a chessboard. By the time Megan had documented the procedure and changed out of her scrubs, Mercer had already activated 5 different pressure points simultaneously. The hospital administrator received a call at 12:17 a.m. Vincent Lancaster, a political appointee who had donated $40,000 to the hospital board's capital campaign and received a C-suite position as compensation, listened while Mercer explained that a nurse had performed an invasive procedure outside her scope of practice. That this constituted grounds for immediate suspension. That failure to act would expose the hospital to liability. Lancaster, a man whose medical knowledge came from hospital board meetings and a golf foursome with Mercer's mentor, said the word that would change everything: suspended. By Tuesday morning, an investigator named Patricia Chen had arrived at Cedar Creek Medical with a briefcase full of credential requests. She was a specialist in employment fraud, the kind of professional who had built her career identifying nurses with falsified certifications. She sat across from Megan in a windowless conference room, fluorescent lights humming like cicadas trapped in plastic above their heads, and she opened a file. Your nursing school transcripts show a 6-month gap. Your employment history has a 2-year hole. Chen's voice was clinical, precise, the voice of someone reading a checklist. Your references don't return calls. Miss O'Brien, did you falsify your credentials? Megan's hands were flat on the conference table. Steady. The kind of steady that comes from having already survived the worst. She couldn't answer with the truth. The truth was classified. The truth was that the 6-month gap was a forward operating base in Loga Province. The truth was that the 2-year hole was force recon training and a mission that the Pentagon had erased from official records, that had cost her the right to use her actual rank, that had scattered her team across new identities in 12 different states. The truth was that her references were Pentagon routing numbers that had been designed to fail, to leave no trace, to return silence instead of confirmation. She said nothing. Chen made a note. The pen scratched against paper like a knife on bone. By Wednesday, Dr. Mercer walked to the nurses' station during the morning shift change. He had printed the termination letter on official hospital letterhead. He held it like a document from a court and he read it aloud with the measured cadence of a man executing a strategy, effective immediately, for credential inconsistencies and unauthorized medical procedures. Your employment at Cedar Creek Medical is terminated. Security was already waiting. They had been waiting for 17 minutes. They escorted Megan out while her former colleagues watched, some with pity in their eyes, most with the careful neutrality of people protecting themselves. One nurse looked away entirely. The nurse who had handed her the needle, who had understood in that moment what she was doing and why. Even compassion wasn't safe enough to display. Megan carried her personal effects in a cardboard box because that's what happened to people who disappeared. A cracked coffee mug someone had given her in the break room 3 months ago. A photograph of her team, 12 people arranged in front of a compound wall, half of them no longer breathing, the other half scattered into the kind of new lives where they couldn't use their own names. A dying succulent that a trauma resident had gifted her with a note that said, "Thanks for keeping me sane." Inside her jacket lining, sewn with the careful precision of someone who understood that objects carry memory, was a faded unit patch from the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. The only physical proof she had ever served. The only evidence that Captain Megan O'Brien existed outside of classified files and Pentagon records. It had survived every transition, every new identity, every interrogation. It would survive this one too. The rain started as she stood at the bus stop, a cardboard box clutched against her ribs like something that could be dropped, like something that wasn't the only tangible proof of who she had been. The sky had opened the way Denver skies do in autumn, sudden, absolute, the kind of weather that erased footprints and washed away the traces of people. Behind her, through the rain, Cedar Creek Medical continued its work. The general was still in bed 7, still breathing, still alive because someone had moved faster than protocol allowed. She had no idea what was about to walk through those emergency room doors. The security footage would later show that Dr. Mercer's hands were shaking as he dialed the first number from his office phone at 11:51 p.m., 11 minutes after Megan's needle had slid between the general's ribs and the entire trauma unit had held its breath as oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 94. He didn't sit. He paced the width of his desk like a caged animal, his $8,000 watch catching the fluorescent light, his jaw working against words he couldn't yet say aloud. The board chairman picked up on the second ring. Mercer didn't bother with pleasantries. "We have a credentialing issue. Immediate. Someone's been practicing medicine without proper documentation." It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in the language of procedure. By 1:15 a.m., Mercer had called for board members, 3 orthopedic surgeons who'd benefited from his referral networks, 1 cardiologist whose daughter interned at his surgical practice, each time using the same measured tone, the same carefully chosen words, credibility gaps, documentation inconsistencies, protocol violations. He didn't lie. Lying was unnecessary. Omission was a tool sharper than any blade. By 3:27 a.m., while Megan sat in the break room filing incident reports with steady hands, Mercer was on the phone with the references listed on her original nursing application, a school nurse from a district in northern Colorado who remembered her vaguely, a clinical supervisor from a traveling agency who'd retired 3 years ago and whose memory was conveniently fuzzy, a charge nurse at a Colorado Springs hospital who'd left no forwarding information. Each conversation followed the same script, just verifying some details about her clinical competency. Specific instances where she might have exceeded her scope. The gaps appeared like cracks in thin ice. Nobody had written incident reports. Nobody had documentation from the specifics. What they had was doubt, the kind that spreads through administrative channels like a virus, each retelling adding new weight, new concern, each conversation building a paper trail that looked, on the surface, like routine credentialing verification. By Thursday morning, Mercer had brought in an HR investigator from outside the hospital, a woman named Patricia Hollis whose rate was $2,000 per day and whose specialty was ferreting out fraudulent credentials. Mercer had planted the seed carefully. She performed an advanced procedure with what appears to be unauthorized training. Military-adjacent techniques. Possibly self-taught. Hollis was thorough. She pulled Megan's original application and began making calls, nursing boards in 3 states, the Colorado Board of Nursing, Credential Verification Services. She reviewed Megan's licensure renewal documents, her CPR certifications, the mandatory continuing education hours. Everything was legitimate. Everything was current. But legitimacy and doubt don't occupy the same space, and Mercer had been careful to emphasize the gaps between what was documented and what was performed. When Megan was called into HR on Friday morning at 6:08 a.m., deliberately before her shift, deliberately when she'd be tired, deliberately when she couldn't consult with union representation, she sat across from Patricia Hollis and Dr. Mercer in a conference room that smelled of industrial coffee and stale air. Hollis had the application in front of her, color-coded tabs marking sections. Your certification lists training at Fort Carson Military Medical Center. Can you explain that? Megan's voice remained level. Trauma rotation. Open curriculum. For 3 weeks. Not a question. A statement. Yes. Hollis turned a page. But your resume lists 12 months of trauma experience. That's a gap of 9 months. Where were you? This was the moment Mercer had orchestrated, the moment where the only true answer would be the answer that couldn't be given. Where Captain Megan O'Brien, Force Recon, classified operation, Pentagon directive, erased service record, new identity, don't surface, don't acknowledge, don't confirm, would collide with civilian explanation. Megan couldn't say Bagram. Couldn't say 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. Couldn't say the patch sewn into her jacket represented 17 kilometers of hostile territory and 8 lives extracted and a memory she'd carried for 2 years in silence. She could say nothing. I was deployed. 3 words. The room temperature dropped. Mercer's eyes narrowed, sensing blood in the water. Hollis leaned forward. Deployed where? In what capacity? You listed your employment as civilian nursing throughout this entire period. I can't discuss those details. The words came out exactly as they had to, military precise, classified precise, the kind of wall that looks like evasion when you're trying to defend a lie, but looks like damning evidence when you're trying to hide a truth the government has already buried. Mercer stood. That's all we need. By Friday afternoon, the termination letter was written. Credential inconsistencies. Unverifiable employment history. Scope of practice violations. Falsification of application materials. The language was precise, bureaucratic, unassailable. By Sunday, Megan stood at a rain-soaked bus stop 3 blocks from her apartment in 5 Points, holding a cardboard box that was slowly becoming pulp. The fluorescent hospital badge with her photo, the one where she looked exhausted but competent, sat on top, already damp. Beneath it, a mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, chipped on the rim from years of breakroom dishwashers. A succulent that had been dying on her desk since March, its leaves papery and curled. And beneath that, at the bottom of the box where the cardboard was weakest, a photograph of her team, Charlie Platoon, 2nd Raider Battalion, Kandahar Province, November 2019. 8 faces. Megan could name all of them. 3 were dead. 2 were in witness protection under names she'd never learned. 2 had burned their bridges so thoroughly with the Pentagon that they disappeared into the civilian world without leaving a trace. And 1, the general, still recovering in a hospital bed 5 blocks away, had forgotten her face. The rain came harder, and the photograph began to blur. The general's features smudged into abstraction. The faces of the dead became illegible ghosts. She shifted the box to her left hip, feeling the weight of it, which wasn't much, maybe 8 pounds total, the sum total of 2 years in Denver, 8 months at Cedar Creek Medical, 12 years of service that officially never happened. Inside her jacket, sewn into the lining against her left ribs, the faded unit patch remained dry. That at least had survived. That at least was still proof. The next morning, pure accident, or perhaps the universe's sense of irony, the kind that gets filed away in case files and never explained, Megan was still in the Cedar Creek Medical Administrative Office trying to retrieve her final paycheck and negotiate the health insurance continuation when the emergency bay intercom crackled to life. All available hands, trauma incoming, ETA 2 minutes, 1 gunshot wound, multiple lacerations. The administrative assistant didn't look up. But Megan's hands moved before her brain caught up. She'd already set the box down. She was already moving toward the stairwell. The habits of a body trained by the Marine Corps don't recognize termination letters. They recognize need. By the time the ambulance doors exploded open, Megan was already in the bay, already gowned, already in the muscle memory space where thinking stops and knowing begins. The stretcher rolled in carrying a man in his 40s, dark beard, dark eyes that should have been confused with shock but weren't. They were sharp, calculating, the eyes of someone used to violence and surveillance and living in spaces where one mistake meant disappearance. Penetrating wound, left abdomen, 1 entry 1 exit, we've got active bleeding, pressure's not holding, his tachycardic at 118, the paramedic called out, already moving with the practiced choreography of handoff. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos, 4s being placed, monitors being attached, suction running, the attending physician calling for imaging. And then the gunshot-wound patient's eyes landed on Megan's face, just for a second, just long enough for recognition to bloom behind his pupils like a flower opening, and his body went rigid against the restraints. His mouth opened and the sound that came out wasn't English. It was Pashto. It was raw. It was the sound of a man whose worst memory had just materialized in scrubs and a ponytail, and his voice cracked across the word like a whip, Valkyrie. The trauma bay froze. Suction still ran. Monitors still beeped. But every human being in that room had turned to stone. He screamed it again, thrashing against the stretcher, Valkyrie. Valkyrie. A young Marine in dress blues visiting his brother in the adjacent bay, visiting his Marine brother, because of course the universe had placed him here, had gone pale. He was already reaching for his pocket. He was already pulling out his phone. Already scrolling. Already finding exactly what he was looking for. And as Megan's hands continued their work, pressure on the abdomen, assessment of the wound tract, the automatic calculations of blood loss and survival probability running through her consciousness like code, that Marine corporal was stepping out of the bay and into the hallway, where staff members were already gathering, already confused, already whispering. He raised his voice. He read from his phone screen in the hallway of Cedar Creek Medical, Captain Megan O'Brien, United States Marine Corps, 2nd Marine Raider Battalion, Force Reconnaissance. The words reached into the trauma bay like fingers through water. Megan's hands didn't stop moving. The wounded man on the stretcher didn't stop struggling. But Dr. Mercer, who'd materialized in the doorway the moment the alarm sounded, went white. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. The screaming cut through the ER like a blade. Pashto words that hadn't left Megan's ears in 7 years, Valkyrie, Valkyrie, tearing from the throat of a man on the gurney, his eyes locked on her face with the kind of recognition that erases time. The former Taliban commander, shot in a convenience store robbery on Evans Avenue, had just identified a ghost. Megan didn't move. Didn't acknowledge the way every head in the trauma bay turned toward her like compass needles finding north. The screaming man knew her call sign. That meant someone else in this hospital was about to know it too. The young Marine corporal visiting his brother in Bay 3 had gone pale. His phone was already in his trembling hands, not trembling from fear, Megan realized, but from adrenaline, from recognition of something the civilian staff couldn't possibly understand. His fingers moved fast across the screen, scrolling, finding, and then his voice rose above the chaos, cracking slightly as he read aloud from his phone, Captain Megan O'Brien. For extraordinary heroism under fire while extracting wounded personnel through 17 kilometers of hostile territory in support of Operation Cordite 6. Citation date, August 15, 2016. Navy Cross. The corporal's voice wavered on those last 3 words like he was holding something sacred. Around the ER, nurses froze mid-motion. A doctor's pen stopped moving on a chart. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent white noise above a room that had suddenly stopped breathing. Mercer was still frozen in the doorway where he'd materialized, his face cycling through emotions like a computer processing corrupted data. Confusion first. Then rage. Then something worse, the first creeping tendrils of understanding that he'd made a catastrophic error. But that wasn't the moment that ended him. The general appeared in his wheelchair at the bay entrance, pushed by a nurse whose face had gone pale. His hand gripped the armrest so hard the knuckles had drained white, and when he locked eyes with Megan, something shifted in his expression that looked like a man recovering a piece of his soul he'd thought was lost. His legs moved, trembling, shaking, but they moved. He rose on those legs that shouldn't have supported his weight, that the doctors said might never carry him again, and when a staff nurse moved to gently push him back down, he raised one hand in a gesture that stopped her mid-motion. His eyes never left Megan's face. Then another nurse, Marcus Chen, the IT specialist who'd been watching from the corner of the bay with the calm intensity of someone who'd stood watch in worse places, stepped forward and carefully peeled back Megan's jacket at the shoulder. Her scrubs fell away to reveal the faded unit patch beneath, the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion insignia sewn into the fabric so carefully, so precisely, that the stitching had held for 2 years without a single thread coming loose. The general's arm came up in a salute. Not casual. Not ceremonial. A full military salute from a man who'd been trained by the same corps that had trained her, and when his arm met his chest, something in the room shifted like a locked door finally swinging open. Tears were running down his face. He hadn't spoken, hadn't said a single word, but that salute contained everything: gratitude, recognition, apology for the 3 miles she'd carried him through that sandstorm while rounds were cutting the air around them both. The doors to the ER burst open at 18:47 hours. 2 men in suits. Not hospital administration. Not local law enforcement. Federal. You could see it in the way they moved, the way the room unconsciously repositioned itself around their presence like water around a stone. One reached into his jacket and withdrew a credential folder, opened it with one fluid motion, and spoke with the kind of authority that made titles irrelevant. Captain Megan O'Brien? We're DOD investigators. We need to speak with you regarding Operation Cordite 6. This is not a request. The second man's jaw was squared like concrete, and his eyes were already scanning the room, cataloging exits and threats with the mechanical precision of someone trained for exactly this scenario. Mercer's voice cracked across the chaos. Stolen Vela. She's a fraudster. I have documentation. His hand was reaching for his badge, for his phone, for something to reassert authority that was already evaporating like breath on cold glass. No one turned to look at him. The federal agents didn't break stride toward Megan. The general remained at attention, tears still streaming, hands still at his chest. One of the nurses actually stepped between Mercer and the federal agents, a subtle repositioning that might have looked accidental if you weren't paying attention. It wasn't accidental. It was the sound of loyalty changing direction like a compass needle swinging toward true north. Mercer's network was crumbling. He didn't know it yet, but by that afternoon, the hospital administrator who'd signed off on Megan's termination was sitting in an emergency meeting with the hospital's legal team. A Marine veteran nurse director had filed a formal complaint about the termination, and 3 board members were suddenly very concerned about the optics of firing a decorated war hero. By Tuesday, Mercer realized his allies were evaporating. The board members who owed him favors were returning calls with cold professionalism, their voices carrying the particular distance of people who'd just realized they were standing on the wrong side of history. The state nursing board investigator he'd contacted had closed her inquiry after a single phone call from the Pentagon confirmed Megan's credentials were legitimate and classified. She'd hung up without another word. But Mercer wasn't the type to accept erasure quietly. On Wednesday night, he made his final, fatal mistake. He accessed the hospital's security system after hours using his administrative override, the kind of access that a chief of surgery accumulated like a disease. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this before. File after file. Deleting the recordings of the past 3 weeks. Footage that showed him fabricating medication errors. Coaching other staff to avoid Megan. Deliberately posting false write-ups on the unit board. Every frame that proved he was a liar, he tried to erase. The deletion bar crawled. 10%. 40%. 60%. 80%. Almost there. Almost clean. Almost invisible. What Mercer didn't know was that Marcus Chen had been watching from the beginning. Marcus, the hospital's IT security specialist and Navy veteran who'd served 2 tours on a carrier, Essex-class, guided missile destroyer, the kind of ship where you learn to notice when something wasn't adding up. He'd recognized something in Megan's bearing from day one. The way she moved through spaces like she was always checking exits. The way her eyes tracked threats like someone whose survival had once depended on it. When she was fired, Marcus had backed up every single frame of security footage to an external drive. Military discipline. Attention to detail. The kind of instinct that makes soldiers dangerous and invaluable in equal measure. Now, as Mercer's digital fingerprints appeared in the system logs, timestamps, access records, a digital trail that would have made a crime scene investigator weep, Marcus was already compiling his report for the board. Every timestamp. Every deletion. Every frame of the original footage showing what Mercer had tried to erase. Thursday morning, Mercer arrived to find his office locked. His credentials were deactivated. Friday, he sat across from the state medical board as they reviewed the evidence frame by frame, Marcus's report open on the table between them like an indictment. The footage was pristine. Every lie documented. Every fabrication caught in perfect digital clarity. 6 months later, Megan O'Brien stood in her new office on the 4th floor of Cedar Creek Medical. The nameplate on the door read Captain Megan O'Brien, Director of Emergency Medicine. Her Navy cross hung on the wall beside her Silver Star and her Marine Corps commission, framed in shadowbox glass. The Pentagon had spent 3 months reviewing her case, deciding that enough time had passed, enough players had rotated out, that Cordite 6 could be partially declassified. She could surface. Not with full honors. Not with her complete record. But with enough truth to let her breathe. Below her window, in the loading dock behind the hospital, Dr. Mercer loaded boxes of gauze and surgical supplies into a medical supply van. His license was suspended for 3 years. 2 civil suits from former colleagues hung over his head like a storm system. His Ivy League credentials might as well have been printed on the cardboard he was stacking. Their eyes met through the glass. Megan stood. She didn't smile. Didn't speak. Just offered him the same cold, flat stare he'd tried so hard to break in that general's room, and then added a precise 2-finger salute. Not respect. Not mockery. Acknowledgement of a defeated enemy. Recognition that the game was over, that he'd lost, that she'd won not through any grand gesture but through the simple, crushing act of telling the truth. He looked away first. She turned back to her desk. The Marine General's handwritten notes sat centered in a small brass stand, an invitation to the ceremony where he'd finally receive the medals his injury had delayed, and a request, please stand beside me when they call my name. The dying succulent from her cardboard box sat on her windowsill, somehow still alive. Somehow thriving. On her desk, a new photo, her old team and 3 new faces. Nurses from Cedar Creek who'd reached out after the reveal, who'd apologized, who'd asked to learn. At the bottom of the frame, someone had written in careful script, "True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching." Her radio crackled. Multi-vehicle accident on I-25. 5 minutes out. 3 trauma patients incoming. Megan's hand moved to her radio before the transmission finished, muscle memory, the kind of reflexive response that training burns into your nervous system. She stood, and as she passed the mirror, she caught her reflection wearing her own name for the first time in 2 years. Captain. Not just a nurse. Not a ghost. Not someone hiding in the margins. She headed for the ER bay where she'd always belonged, finally wearing the truth. If you've ever been underestimated and nobody knew it until the moment you proved them dead wrong, like this video and subscribe for more stories where the quiet ones save everyone. Drop a comment. Have you ever judged someone only to find out you were catastrophically wrong about who they were?